Shah is a PhD student at Arizona State University, researching on building interpretable AI models for healthcare disorders like Alzheimer's disease and post-traumatic headache. In the past, he has interned at NTU Singapore HackerRank, Philips Research Labs, and also worked with a Nobel laureate. Jay also hosts a podcast about machine learning for beginners, which now has more than 50,000 downloads and 1,650 plus subscribers. He was recently named an IEEE Impact Creator. Thank you so much for joining us, Jay.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
So, were you always into technology? Did you always know that you wanted to be an engineer?
Yeah, I think I was interested in technology at a fairly young age. I think it was one of the summer schools that I had in my high school when we were supposed to build this robot that we attended in a summer school, and we were supposed to build this robot from a very scratch version. So we were supposed to put these components together, do the soldering of these components, build a very nice program that can move the robot, and after the workshop, the end product that I had in my hand, and this was fairly before the time that I was actually learning the programming. So this was much more in the school version where you don't know how exactly these components are built. But at the end product, we built this robot that used to have two motors that would drive the robot forward, and one motor that would move the robotic arm so that you can do anything with the robot. So the end product really looked interesting to me, and that was the time that I think I became fairly interested in technology and maybe figure out that, hey, I want to do computer science. I want to learn what this programming can help me do. And the fact that as a student, I learned that you can assemble something on your own, and be it like you can have an outlet of your creativity in a very technical sense. So that was the kind of outburst for me into being interested into technology. And yeah, this led to me being a computer science majors. And yeah, so far it's going great. I mean, definitely I've learned a lot more than just programming, but that was one of the inception points for me to be interested in being an engineer.
At what point did you become interested in machine learning?
Yes. So the pathway for machine learning kind of feels similar, but it was definitely after. So when I started my undergrad college, and we were being taught into the basics of programming and all those things, and as a student, you ask yourself the question that I'm learning these techniques, these very fundamental science. How do I apply them into the real world? So what are the application looking like? And this was a time that I, just like many of the other people who stumble onto machine learning, is using these media articles and people who are talking on podcasts talking about machine learning and how cool it is, right? So I think that is how I got into machine learning, but that was just a very clickbaity version of me getting into machine learning. But the real interest in machine learning happened to me when I attended my first abroad internship at NTU Singapore, and I actually got to work with a very serious professor who was one of the biggest collaborators in open source sciences on video compression and decompression algorithms. And even though my contribution over there was fairly insignificant at that time, because I was just an undergrad student, but what I learned, and a takeaway for me from there, was that if you want to be a person who can create something or work on something that is impactful, the essentials of contributing to machine learning would be some kind of research. That appealed to me a lot. And having that set of tools at your hand, at your disposal, machine learning can enable you to contribute to something that is so much impactful. So I think that really stick into my mind, that programming is great. Learning the fundamentals of computer science is great. It's beautiful. But taking it to the next step is maybe understanding machine learning, how you can apply it to the real world. So I think that fact really stayed to me. And we have all these, we always have these interests of like, how do I create impact? So understanding that machine learning research could be my way of appealing to creating something impactful.
And that's interesting that you say that podcast helped give you exposure to the subject, considering you've now created this YouTube channel. What's been your biggest challenge of creating a YouTube channel that focuses specifically on machine learning?
Yeah, in terms of challenges, I think, of course, you are also a podcast host, and you also might have came across these challenges is asking the right sort of questions to the person. So I think when I'm researching these people who I want to be a guest on my podcast, it definitely these people have like immense amount of research expertise. So asking them, like, first of all, maybe if I ask them a question like, what does machine learning mean to you, it would have some kind of different flavor to it. So asking the right set of questions to these people is definitely a big challenge for me, but something I really enjoy, because trying to learn like what machine learning means to them, every time I get a different response, and maybe understanding their motivation. So I think figuring out who is the best speaker and who can really help young engineers, because the idea of that podcast channel is to help young machine learning enthusiasts get into the world of machine learning, right? So trying to bridge those pros and cons of both the worlds. Like, I'm also trying to help students versus I'm also trying to make sure that the podcast host or the podcast speaker has a great time being on the podcast. So I think those kind of balancing things really feel challenging, but I really enjoy. Like, it's a great deal of thing that is typically not taught in textbooks anyway. So it's definitely fun. Yeah.
And that's what I've noticed. Your interview is so conversational. It's so relaxed. It's very interesting, but it almost feels like I'm a fly on the wall sitting in your living room, just taking in the discussion. I wonder if that's what's led to, I think there's over, 1,500 plus subscribers on this YouTube channel. And with it being such a niche topic, I'm curious what you think has led to this level of interest.
Yes, I think the unique selling point of the podcast would be, I try to make it like, for example, even before I created these podcasts, I used to listen to a lot of podcasts, and they were often into the two amazing buckets. You would feel extremely technical, where the person would go on talking about the research, and the person who's listening, who might not have understanding, might just feel bummed out, like, okay, I don't know into much that much depth of machine learning. And versus somebody would be talking too much superficial, that, hey, machine learning is cool, it's going to change the world, the movies like Terminator are going to be real, and people are going to die and killed by AI. And these two extremes were definitely fun, but they are not the reality. So people who are starting into the machine learning are somewhere in between. They also want to be technical, but they also want to have some fun. Like, I'm sure most of the machine learning researchers have some kind of very amazing own personal life agenda, how they got into machine learning, right? So I think the unique point I try to cover through these podcasts is maybe understand their stance of what does machine learning research mean to them, and then maybe ask some very very short and very sweet technical questions. What do you mean by these kind of technologies? What do you see yourself? What do you see these fields going into the next few years? And I think that kind of getting a sweet spot, maintaining between the speaker's interest and also the listener's interest, has maybe led to a good amount of people who are interested into listening to these podcasts. Yeah.
And is your target audience mostly then students who are also exploring the target, or who are you making this for?
I think students would be a very definitive majority of the audience that I have, but I think it's really anyone who is getting started into machine learning, because I've had this people who would reach out to me on LinkedIn, and they are into their senior fields, but they might be starting into machine learning at a very fairly older age, but even in that case, they would have started in the last few years. So I think students are the majority, but definitely anyone who is getting started into machine learning, be and trying to find himself or herself into that particular confusion domain, that yes, I'm interested, but where do I start? The resources on internet feel so much overwhelming. Where do I begin with? So those kind of people are the typical audience for these podcasts.
And one thing I really admire about your series is how much you have just thrown yourself into it and devoted yourself to this, from designing your beautiful backdrop to the thumbnails to just the content itself. You've been really purposeful and really proactive. Was it a little bit daunting starting out on this project, or did you know that it would get to this point?
I kind of had some feelings like it would get daunting, as in the kind of, for example, I have seen people who are creating these kind of podcasts on a very professional scale. I mean, they are definitely putting their blood, sweat, 24/7 amount of pressure into these kind of things. And I definitely didn't have that much of a broad width of ideas that how I want to scale. Like, for example, people do ask me these questions when I get to talk to them, is like, how where do you see your YouTube channel in the next 5 years? And I was like, next 5 years, like I don't know how it's going to be in the next 5 weeks. I don't have any idea. So I think daunting might not be the right word, but I often feel confused that how do I want to take that? Because I see a great deal of people who every day I wake up and people leave messages on my LinkedIn chat or on my Twitter chats that they really find it interesting. And at the same time, I'm flattered, but also I'm trying to make it kind of useful to them. I don't want to break that particular chain that, hey, I did something terrible and you were praising me for nothing. So it definitely doesn't feel daunting, but I'm always curious to make the next step that is kind of elevated from my previous step. So I think that idea is mostly inspirational. I mean, I definitely listen to someone like you, like who are doing tech podcasts, and you are doing an amazing job. So I try to take clickbaits of those kind of things, like what did Jacqueline do that really stood out, versus what the other podcaster do that really stood out, and trying to learn these kind of things. And definitely this is not in any textbook, right? Like nobody teaches you how to create thumbnails so that people might click on the video, but I think that you really learn along the path, and that is kind of fun, I would say. Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but one thing that I've really enjoyed about creating these videos or writing my blogs for IEEE is it's nice to look back and actually see something. I've been working in corporate learning for a while, and you can create a class, but you don't have a result. Maybe I have the lesson plans or the PowerPoint, but I don't necessarily print that out and hold that, and I don't have the same feelings as I do when I look at the archive of my blog articles, and I remember the feeling that I felt when I finished writing one of them that just felt exceptionally like it really captured the point. And so that's something I've personally really enjoyed about anytime I'm content creating. I'm curious if it's similar for you.
Yes. And I think, yeah, I'm definitely agreeing to that. And one of the beautiful things that I've noticed over the past few podcasts that I have hosted is, initially I was the kind of person who was extremely critical of what kind of content I want to go out there, right? So I would definitely prep the speaker. I would ask them what you would be speaking about. I was too much conscious of editing those things out there. But in the past few podcasts, once I've gotten like kind of used to having people and talking about things that we might like he or she might not have talked in the public about, I think kind of a free flowing attitude that I've learned over in the past few podcasts is really helpful. And I think that is one thing that has even led to a greater amount of people appreciating that thing, that we felt like if you see the comments, they are like much more like we find this very candid conversation. And I think, and even I would reflect back on my conversation as to be candid, that yeah, this was really fun, and that really came out into the non-scripty version of these podcasts. So that is one thing even I enjoy, that yes, something came out that wasn't planned, but it's great.
And I've even seen that we're comparing, since you are a student and I kind of have some experiences in the corporate world, I'm seeing that more and more in the corporate world. I wouldn't be surprised if it's still actually it could even be more true in academia, but that kind of marriage of authenticity and candor with curiosity. I think there's a real yearning, especially right now, especially because we're more virtual than we ever were before, but there's a real desire for that connection that is felt when you have the marriage of those two concepts. Would you agree with that?
Yes, definitely. And one of the beautiful things about academia that I think, I mean, definitely industry and academia brings its own flavors of the work that you do. And one of the beautiful things in academia is you're allowed to fail. The kind of the bandwidth of failure that they provide is extensive. So even if you're failing, you wouldn't know that you are failing. And that allowance of like even a failure is kind of a research, right? Like when you are trying to build a research product, you read on people's work who might have said at the end of the research paper that I did this and I failed. Don't try to do these things. So even that kind of research is something really, really valuable. So I think, like you said, curiosity, like even when I talk to my advisor, the way I'm just a very new student into PhD, right? So I'm always curious that I want to get the best result, beating the Google's research work or Microsoft's research work. But I think one thing that she really emphasizes is don't focus on the results. Just focus on what really feels good to you. Like, do you think this is curious enough? Do you think there is kind of a possibility of innovation over there? So I think, yes, I definitely agree. Industry also does that to a certain extent, but academia really allows a student to do it. There's a difference between a researcher at Microsoft doing innovation versus a PhD student who is fairly in his cradle doing these kind of stuffs. So yeah, the marriage of these two ideas is definitely critical and totally real. Yeah.
Well, since you've now queued me up for this, if you don't mind me asking, what would you consider one of your biggest failures of the past 5 years? And how did you feel after that? How did you come away from that?
I think I like I said, I wouldn't call them failures, but I think trying to figure out what really I find impactful, right? Like in the first question that you asked, like how do you define the kind of stuff that you want to do? So I think ending up doing something that even if you're starting, but trying to figure out what is the best thing that interests you versus somebody else. So I think over the time during my masters, during my past internships, or even during my bachelor's, over the time I have done a lot of projects that some of them didn't pan out well in terms of research and expertise, as in like publishing a paper or boasting about those results in a very nice product. But one thing that I learned over those experiences is what really interests me. I mean, machine learning is in itself a huge world. There are many different applications. You can pick up one topic and you can really build an expertise. So I think trying to understand that what interests me right now I'm working on medical imaging aspects of machine learning. That is just a very teeny tiny domain of machine learning, or AI as you would like to say. So I think trying to understand what doesn't work for me and trying to see what really interests me, I would say I have taken failure into that perspective, that I would take a certain opportunity and learn that, hey, this is not really interests me, even though this is a very brilliant field. So I think that's how I like to treat my failures, I would like to say.
Yeah, I love that approach. Can you tell me a little bit more? What did you say that you're currently looking into? Which aspect of machine learning?
Yes. So my current focus of research as a PhD student focuses on medical imaging aspects and building interpretable AI models. So we are typically focused on healthcare applications, for example, long-term disease like post-traumatic headache and Alzheimer's, which are not solved from a medical standpoint. Nobody knows a cure. Like you can just make feel good the patient. Like there are tools and symptoms that doctors can analyze, but they're irreversible, meaning that you cannot reverse the affected patient to being a healthy patient. So there is an active amount of interest and research going on. And since deep learning in itself has proved really helpful, doctors or medical experts are looking into how we can actually predict these kind of diseases early hand. So if the person would be suffering from Alzheimer's in the next 5 years, if I had that information prior hand, I can actually give you some kind of medication or drugs that can help you not get into that phase, or maybe ease out those things. So that's my focus right now. And the idea of using AI on neuroimaging data like brain scans and PET scans, and trying to analyze like what are the structural changes into these patients that are very, very, very minute. Even medical experts cannot see sometimes because of the limitations of human eye. So that is my current focus as of now.
I find that fascinating because Alzheimer's actually runs in my family. And I have several friends who are doctors, and we've had conversations over a period of time about how medicine is getting us to the point where our bodies are lasting for longer, but we haven't resolved some of those cognitive issues that can occur more often with age. And so then you have the problem or the concern or the issue of your physical body being present, but not having those mental capabilities, and knowing that that might be in the future for either myself or my siblings or my loved ones. That's definitely something that I have considered over a period of time.
Yeah, definitely. It's once I got into this field as a student, I could actually see the kind of interest that the community has, because when you talk to these medical experts who have been in this field for the next or the last 40 years, and the way they treat these kind of results or discoveries is really astonishing. I mean, these people are brilliant people who have been working on these fields for so much amount of time, and trying to see that even if there is at least a 5% chance that deep learning can help these medical experts, it's a huge impact in my sense. Like, we are trying to solve these two very fundamental sciences, right? Like using mathematics and AI, and then applying it to medical research, which has evolved over the last few decades or even centuries. So I think that really inspires me personally, but definitely it has a much more greater impact. Like you said, it could be life changing for some people.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. It affects the quality of life, not only for the individual, but for the community around them. Absolutely.
Yep.
Where do you see these emerging technologies going for this? If you could predict this, I know it's so hard when we've had so many changes in the last couple of years, but where do you see this going?
Yeah, I think in terms of a bird's view angle for these kind of technologies, I think the idea of democratization of AI, you see, right? Like, the way AI was treated, at least in the last 10 years, has changed a lot. The way you are interacting with technology is much different than what you did 10 years back, right? It is kind of a way of life right now. And I think the one of the most significant impact that AI will have is healthcare community, not just in terms of, let's say, Alzheimer's or post-traumatic, but it is definitely much more wider to that. And I often like to say this in an analogy, is like the way how computers changed the world before 1960s and after 1960s. Like, you cannot imagine, like you might ask questions like, how did people used to do this stuff before computers, right? Like, you just cannot sometimes imagine these kind of applications working without computers. And I think that's kind of the similar change in the next 10 years that I'm predicting, that the way healthcare is being assessed right now, the way I, as an individual who doesn't have any medical expertise, the way I am treating healthcare is going to be much more different in the next 10 years, meaning I would have a much more greater variety of tools at my own disposal. Like, for example, I have been using Apple Watch since last 1 year, and it is a great tool. I mean, if I were to say to my father, who I often talk to, and I tell them that I can accurately see my heart rates, and they would be really shocked that, okay, how can you do that? We need to go to a doctor, use a big equipment to do those things. And these kind of small changes, this is still insignificant, but for greater assessments like heart strokes and some kind of very underlying conditions could be detected using these combination of good biosensors and application of AI on edge devices, is something I personally am really optimistic about in the next at least 10 years or maybe more than that. Yeah.
Oh, Jay, I love your attitude. I love your content. I love what you are doing and where you're going with the future. If the audience wants to continue following you, what's the best way to follow your work?
Yeah, I'm always happy to help anybody who's starting into this field, and definitely they can ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'm fairly active and happy to help on any of those platforms. So yeah, definitely they can find me on these platforms using my first name and last name, and I'll be happy to have a chat with them.
It's great talking with you. Thank you again for sitting down with us today.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please click like below and also subscribe to see future episodes.